Okay, I think we got some people signing in now. We'll give them a minute to sign in and then we can get started with the introductions. Well, greetings everyone online. Welcome to our first in what we hope is a series on Taiwan. Today, I'm super pleased to bring you our first talk with featured guest Iman Lau from Doublethink Labs. My name's Sean Simmons. I'm president of the Prince George branch of the Canadian International Council. And since this is for CIC, I won't go into detail about the Canadian International Council, other than it's a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. If you're interested in more information, please visit thecic.org. I'll start with a little bit of background on how we came to this series. Our branch launched a study group last year on foreign interference, and as we were going through the process and the study group learning, one of the key questions is, what role do civic organizations play in dealing with foreign interference? And I had a good conversation with the president of the NATO Association of Canada, and he had mentioned that he had just recently done a tour through Taiwan and met with a number of the civic organizations there. And so that really triggered the idea, well, let's see if we can reach out to some of these organizations in Taiwan that are currently dealing with this and see if there's some lessons we might be able to learn. And so this first pilot event is going to see if we can use this as a template and explore how civic organizations within Taiwan deal with foreign interference, and in this case, disinformation. A little bit of housekeeping before I pass it off to our partner in Toronto. So Iman will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes. And then what we're going to do is we're going to open it up for question and answer. So you will notice at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A tab. If you have questions, please enter your questions in there, and then we'll answer them after the talk. And I believe that's all I've got for housekeeping. So let me pass it off to Christian, and he can tell you a little bit about the Toronto branch and introduce Iman. Christian, off to you.
Thank you, Sean. I'm the president of the Toronto branch of the Canadian International Council, and I'm happy to be co-hosting this event. I've had the privilege to have heard Iman speak before, and the Doublethink Lab is a fascinating organization, and I'm very pleased that we have the opportunity to showcase the good work that the Doublethink Lab does to what this evening amounts in many respects to a pan-Canadian audience. So that's a little bit about me and why I'm here. And I was very excited when Sean had proposed this project. So look forward to this and other talks like it. Thank you.
Need to reactivate my audio. Well, let me introduce our speaker tonight. Iman Lau is the social engagement team lead at Doublethink Lab and former advisor to Alliance Canada Hong Kong. She has appeared in Canadian media discussing Hong Kong and Canada-China relations, and her articles have appeared in major Canadian newspapers. She has also testified before Canadian and European parliaments on the political crackdown in Hong Kong and foreign interference. In her role at Doublethink Lab, she has conducted research on foreign transnational repression and the Chinese diaspora. She holds a Master's of Public Policy and a Bachelor of Social Work with distinction from the University of Calgary. She is currently based in Taipei, Taiwan. Welcome, Iman.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for to the Canadian International Council for the opportunity to present today. I am very excited to always present back to a Canadian audience. I am Canadian myself, to be clear. I'm from Calgary, Alberta. So always happy to do so. And I'm glad to see there's more interest in Taiwan as well and in learning from Taiwan. So today's presentation just a very quick overview. I'm going to go through Doublethink Lab, some of the work we do, our teams, and then I'm going to dive a little bit into some of the definitions of what we mean by information operations, discuss a little bit about Taiwan's political context and why it makes it so vulnerable to information operations by the PRC, or the People's Republic of China. And then I'll dive into some of a major project that Doublethink Lab undertakes during all elections in Taiwan since 2020, which is our Monitoring Hub project. And afterwards, I will be also discussing a report that we had published this year called the Taiwan Power Model Report, which is looking into what is exactly Taiwan's model to counter disinformation and information operations. So to start, Doublethink Lab was founded in 2019. We are a fairly new organization. We've been around for 5 years now. We have 3 teams, which is the digital intelligence team, the global research team, and the social engagement team, which is my team, the one that I lead. So first off, with social engagement, we're really looking into what is exactly the psychology and sociology behind information and influence operations by the PRC, or China by China. What we mean by this is basically we want to explore various factors of information and influence operations. So why do people fall for disinformation is one of the key questions we ask. What makes them more susceptible to falling for disinformation? What are the impacts of foreign interference or of information manipulation in Taiwan on wider Taiwanese society? And then we've recently branched out into looking into transnational repression and their impacts on the dissident community as well too. So one of the key projects I worked on was looking into China's efforts, or the PRC's efforts, to co-opt and influence Chinese diaspora communities. So we did a comparative analysis between New Zealand and Malaysia, looking at their overseas Chinese communities in both countries to better understand why might these communities either support or not support the PRC, or how likely are they to agree with PRC narratives. Being like, China is great, China has done so much for poverty alleviation, China, if you are Chinese and overseas, you are beholden to the PRC, which is a policy that the PRC has implemented under their Overseas Chinese Affairs Office. So we wanted to look into the impact of those efforts. This is a few of our projects related to transnational repression. Transnational repression is a tactic undertaken by foreign governments to silence dissidents or criticism overseas. This is done through many different ways, such as surveillance, intimidation, and harassment as well. So we documented how China is silencing dissidents overseas through a series of projects. And then we also provided some training for these dissidents to better protect themselves. We've also branched out into looking into the ways that Russia and China may cooperate on disinformation. So one of our more recent projects was looking at how Taiwan's elections and sovereignties have been framed in the Russian language space, particularly by pro-Kremlin, pro-Russian Telegram users. So this was one of our reports that we put out this year. The next team is our global research team. So the global research team is dedicated to mapping China's global influence tactics across the world. They are responsible for managing a big network called the China and the World Network. And then we also have a summit, annual summit every year. This, we bring together for about a 2-3 day summit, journalists, civil society members, academics, experts in the China field. This year, I actually just came back from our summit, which was held in Johannesburg, South Africa. So that summit was quite interesting as we focused a lot on the PRC's influence in Africa. Another big project the global research team does is something called the China Index. Now, the China Index is a project that attempts to measure China's global influence across the world and put it all together into a comparative index that can be used by policymakers and to provide a basis for folks to take a look at to see how are they doing in terms of other countries and whatnot. This is open source. There's a QR code on the screen, and there's also the link to the website if you'd like to take a look yourself. We are trying very hard to get our 2023 results out as quick as possible as we're coming up to the end of the year here. But yeah, we've had a few bumps along the way, but hopefully that comes out fairly shortly here. So what do we mean by influence as well too? So this is Canada's ranking in 2022, which is we are 37 out of 82 countries. We couldn't get all the countries because we had to identify an appropriate subject matter expert. And in some countries, we couldn't find the appropriate expert / it may have been quite, there was a lot of security risks as well too. But in Canada, we are ranking about 37 out of 82. When we talk about influence, we don't necessarily mean that if you rank high or if you have a lot of influence in your country, that does not necessarily mean that you are acting in a way that is favorable to the PRC. We break down influence into 3 categories, which is exposure. So what are the conditions within the country that might make them quite vulnerable to PRC influence? So what we see in the global south is many countries are looking for more investment for infrastructure, so they become much more vulnerable to some of the incentives the PRC is able to offer through these Belt and Road initiatives. And then pressure, which is something Canada had experienced back in 2020 during the detention of the 2 Michaels. That's probably one of the more extreme pressures. We look into actions where China is directly or indirectly applying pressure for you to act in the way that they want to. And then in the last bit is effect, which is what is the degree of accommodations this target country has made to the PRC and what's the actual effects on the target country. So in the good part here in Canada's case, it's quite low. But we wanted to look into sort of measuring influence on these 3 different layers is what we call them. So the influence, the China Index in itself, they also measure on 11 different categories, which is media, academia, economy, society, military, law enforcement, technology, domestic politics, and foreign policy. Just trying to measure the degree of influence that is exerted in different sectors. For the China Index, if you are interested, at the very end, I'm happy to, I'll provide my email address and I'll be happy to connect anyone who's interested to the China Index to the team that works on this, which is my colleague, Ivan. So our last team is our digital intelligence team. They are more focused on doing a lot of our online research and tracking of information operations and in something called coordinated inauthentic behaviors. I always have to fact check folks when they come to Taiwan and they ask Doublethink Lab if we're a fact-checking organization. We are not. We are a research organization. And what we research is a lot of, we look into narratives, what is being promoted and disseminated online. And we also look into something called coordinated inauthentic behaviors, which I will give some examples later on in this presentation of what we track. But basically, we're researching the folks or the actors, whether they're bots or they're real people, their behaviors around promoting and posting and disseminating disinformation. So some projects that we have been working on with the DI team, we currently have a project funded by the EU where we're trying to build out an Indo-Pacific network. So we are building partnerships across the Indo-Pacific in countries like Myanmar, South Korea, Thailand, Philippines, Malaysia. And the point of this network is to bring people up to the standard of, to Doublethink Lab standard in research on PRC information operations, but also to exchange best practices between countries on how they counter disinformation. I can say that the Philippines are doing excellent work on domestic disinformation. in terms of countering it and in terms of some of their more civic society activities as well too. They do a lot of pre-bunking, which is instead of debunking, they anticipate narratives that might be circulating during the elections, and they try to put out materials in order to counter against those narratives, which is a form called pre-bunking, which I find really, really fascinating and quite an interesting practice. As I mentioned before, we also started looking into the Russian space as well too. We've done a few projects looking into the first 100 days of the invasion of Ukraine and what type of narratives were being disseminated in the Chinese language space. We also looked into how there has been the promotion of the, Ukrainians or Nazis narrative within the Chinese information space, and then also the spread of the Ukraine biolabs conspiracy content on Twitter. A lot of Chinese officials were promoting this narrative that these biolabs were set up by the United States of America, which was probably in line with deflecting away from blame from COVID, because it aligned with that sort of narrative that it wasn't China's fault. Actually, it was actually the US fault. There was a narrative going around that it was actually maybe potentially the US's fault that COVID started. We also did a project looking into how China is trying to whitewash what's happening in Hong Kong, and how they also are trying to whitewash what's happening in Xinjiang or East Turkestan against the Uyghurs there. We analyzed a lot of narratives on Twitter, and we put them all together into tropes. And we also, this project was interesting in the fact that we tried to look into how disinformation is not just a reading disinformation. It's not just words on a paper. It's also a whole package of videos, of photos, of audio, and they're purposely put together to convey a certain message. So for example, in Hong Kong, there's a lot of photos where they'll be showing the flag of Hong Kong and the flag of China all together in one photo to demonstrate that Hong Kong is actually very supportive of the fact that of the political crackdown in Hong Kong. In Xinjiang, there's a lot of the use of what we say the happy dancing Uyghurs. There's a lot of these cultural events they try to promote to deflect away from accusations of genocide or cultural genocide. There's also a lot of emphasis on economic development in the region as a way to say that actually Chinese government intervention in this region is good. So that was a few of the tropes we were looking into in these reports. So I wanted to sort of take a step back and before we dive into the monitoring hub, and I wanted to talk about what exactly is information operations. It's a little bit of a confusing term. There's a lot of terms that are happening these days too. You'll hear information operations, a term that's being promoted by, I think it's the EU now, is FIMI, or Foreign Information Manipulation and Interference. But basically this encompasses a lot of what we know as disinformation, propaganda, and misinformation. They're all interconnected, but they're a little bit different in definition. So I thought I would go through that very quickly. So propaganda in itself is this persuasive communication that had been used in wars and political campaigns that was aimed at influencing public opinion. It is actually one of our oldest forms of communication. And historically, it was fairly neutral, but a negative connotation of it started to emerge in the 20th century, which is something that you probably will see to this day in the ways that we frame propaganda. But the two posters I have here are examples of propaganda. So the one on the very, my right at least, is when you ride alone, you ride with Hitler, which is a car sharing poster. They were trying to promote people to car share during World War II to conserve oil. So this is what the propaganda poster was trying to do. The one about the rat, that's actually one from Alberta. Alberta is a rat-free province. For those who don't know, we have no rats. It's a bit of a fun fact, but there was a huge campaign to basically exterminate all the rats. And this is a 1950s poster, I believe, propaganda poster about that. So, misinformation in itself. I presented this presentation to university students, so please, there's a lot of memes in here. But I presented it to Taiwan University, but basically misinformation refers to false or inaccurate and or inaccurate information. But the big difference between misinformation and disinformation is the intent in sharing it. Misinformation isn't deliberate. You'll see sometimes folks share certain headlines saying, oh, I learned about this thing through, I felt tremors today. A good example is, I think in Dubai, folks were reporting that there was an earthquake because they were feeling tremors. And that misinformation went pretty widespread, and people started to panic about an imminent earthquake. However, it just turned out people were feeling tremors from a demolition site. So that's what we mean by misinformation. It's inadvertent. It isn't meant to be malicious. It's often just not fact-checking or not really verifying the information that you've seen before sharing it. We've all done it. I've done it myself too. I've accidentally shared misinformation as well too. It's not something that I think is, you know, I know there's a lot of negative connotations towards misinformation, but it's something that happens to all of us. Disinformation, however, is a little different. It is false information, which is deliberately intended to mislead. It does differ from the intention of misinformation due to this intention of deception, and it's an orchestrated adversarial activities. Disinformation is also quite tricky because it uses a lot of various tactics, including lies, and sometimes truths and half-truths and opinions as tools of influence. So it makes it quite difficult to debunk. Oftentimes you'll hear this from researchers in disinformation and misinformation spheres. A lot of it sometimes has a grain of truth in it, so it becomes very difficult to debunk in itself with facts. This photo here is a photo from, I believe, the time when there was wildfires in Hawaii, and there was conspiracy theories of a direct energy weapon that caused the wildfires. So this tweet went viral in trying to promote the fact that the wildfires were started by this direct energy weapon, when it turns out this video that they have been sharing is actually a video of an explosion that happened in a factory in Chile a couple years before. So again, intention was meant to deceive you. It was meant to promote a certain narrative, and that's how we categorize this as more so disinformation. Okay, so we do a project here in Taiwan. We've started this since 2020, where we do a monitoring hub project. What we do is we pull together civil society actors, teams, to observe our elections, both local and nationally, for any sort of suspected foreign interference or information operations as well from the PRC. So why Taiwan? This is a question I always get. Why is Taiwan always ground zero for these information campaigns? Well, it comes down to this question here, which is Taiwan part of China? Obviously in Taiwan, we have a different line. Taiwan is a de facto independent state at the moment. I don't have all the time to delve into the history of Taiwan, but it does come down to the civil war between the KMT, or the Kuomintang, and the Chinese Communist Party, and then the KMT fled to Taiwan, and we operate under the Republic of China, not the People's Republic of China, which is what the PRC's governance is. But basically China, One China policy states that they view Taiwan as an inalienable part of China, and that the PRC is the sole legitimate government. So they've dedicated a lot of resources to information operations targeting Taiwan to undermine trust in their electoral system, in democracy, and as well as in anyone they deem as an adversary. So in this case, it's often targeted towards the Democratic People's Party, or the DPP. And that also means that they've dedicated a lot of resources to influencing other countries abroad. I can't quite remember, I think it's around 12 or 13. I don't remember the official number of actual diplomatic allies that Taiwan has, but it's a very small number. And China has done its best to exclude Taiwan from international organizations. We don't have a seat at the UN. We don't have, critically a couple years ago, we did not have a seat at the WHO, World Health Organization, which was to the detriment of everyone, as Taiwan was warning quite early on about the spread of COVID. And as well as China has done quite a bit to block politicians who are seen as friendly to Taiwan. There's a great new article in the New York Times about a key figure who has been influencing a lot of the Chinese diaspora and elections in New York. That just recently got published, talking about how he also blocks. He managed to fundraise and influence many communities to vote against a Taiwanese-born Democrat, I believe, who lost their seat in the last election as well too. So there is a lot of resources dedicated to this issue, to say the least. Let me see. And so very quickly, in Taiwan's political context, unlike other countries I've noticed, or if I can make a generalization, what I've noticed within other countries is foreign policy does not play a role front and center. If I ever watch a Canadian debate, especially our federal elections, I find that the section on foreign policy is pretty measly sometimes. It's not very well thought out, or there's not a lot of nuanced debates on this. In Taiwan, it's quite different, whereas foreign policy, or particularly cross-strait relations with China, takes a center stage in a lot of the national politics. As I mentioned before, this comes down to the One China principle, or the One China policy. And there is a China factor in Taiwanese elections. A lot of times there is a question of how to deal with China here in Taiwan. There is a camp that believes that to lower tensions with Taiwan, we should be, less assertive. We should be a lot more willing to trade and engage in businesses with China, and we shouldn't be so loud in how we want to, demand a global presence for Taiwan, or assert the Taiwanese identity. There is a camp in Taiwan like that as well too. But I will say in recent years, we have seen how the China factor in Taiwanese elections has played a bit of a detrimental effect to the PRC. The photo on the screen you're seeing right now was a protest in 2014 of the Sunflower Movement, which was a student-led protest against the KMT, who had tried to sign and enact a free trade agreement with China, much to the anger of the Taiwanese populace, because they believed that bill wasn't really democratically discussed. There was not a lot of transparent mechanisms to review that bill either. So that led to the peaceful occupation of the Legislative Yuan, which is what you're seeing here on screen. But what happened, the impacts of this Sunflower Movement also led to the landslide election of Tsai Ing-wen in 2016 and the DPP coming to power. And so that kind of shows that there was that China factor that had an impact there. And then in 2019, what happened was there was the 2019 Hong Kong protests and the subsequent political crackdown. And then as well, coupled with China's hardline approach to Taiwan, they were doing a lot more saber rattling at that time in regards to Taiwan. So that also led to the re-election of Tsai Ing-wen, which was quite surprising for many people, because actually before the 2019 Hong Kong protests, she wasn't very popular. There has been a rise in Taiwan of the Taiwanese identity, which is something that China has actively tried to undermine. We are doing a project here at Doublethink Lab at looking at how Russia and China tries to undermine both the Ukrainian and Taiwanese identity, respectively. China likes to insist that because of shared history and culture and norms and tradition, Taiwan is a part of China and everyone on the island is Chinese. You see that quite a bit. However, in Taiwan, there is more and more people. Actually, it's quite rare to find someone here in Taiwan that identifies as Chinese solely. They might identify as Taiwanese Chinese, but that also has been decreasing. And now today, most people will identify as Taiwanese. There's also the support for reunification is very unpopular. It's gone downhill quite a bit. I will say that most of the majority supports status quo, or what we have right now, but even that has its nuances as well. The National Chengchi University here, they do a great election, they do a great survey on the Taiwanese identity and also people's attitudes to reunification. They've been charting this for a very, very long time. So what we're seeing over time is a rise in the Taiwanese identity and a lot of lack of support for the reunification. So we're starting to see, I think that all in all indicates that maybe the PRC information operations isn't as impactful as they had hoped either. But in this 2024 elections, we had a bit of a different scenario. Now, a lot of people, you know, some of the ways people conceptualize Taiwan, which I find interesting, is there's some people that wonder why people could support the KMT or why they might vote for the KMT, especially if the KMT has a very pro-China image. In some extreme characterizations, they're viewed as the reunification party. The point of this is that the reason people vote for the KMT or they might support the KMT is very, very diverse and also really largely falls upon the dynamics of democracy. The DPP in 2024 had been ruling for 8 years. There was a lot of frustration growing towards very, I think, problems that we all can relate to that has also impacted Canada. There is skyrocketing housing markets here. The prices here are pretty high. It's quite an expensive city to own a house in Taipei. And we have persistently low wages here in Taiwan as well. So it's getting tougher to make a living here. So Taiwan also is experiencing a lot of brain drain and has a low birth rate as well. So all this frustration in 8 years have built up towards the DPP. So there was this question of, well, who are we going to vote for in 2024? Because we're not happy with the DPP. But on the flip side, a lot of young people felt alienated by the KMT. So this gave rise to a new party, the Taiwan's People Party, led by Ko Wen-je. But that seemed to gain a lot of momentum. And while William Lai of the DPP did win the last election, he lost the majority in the legislative yuan. So that makes it much more difficult to pass bills or enact any change, which is something that we started to see. We had protests in May due to some reforms the KMT and the TPP had tried to push through. It's still ongoing. Protests are still also ongoing as well, too. And Taiwan's People Party has kind of fallen apart. Ko Wen-je was arrested on corruption charges. So we're not too sure what the future of that party is. But this is all in all to show that they were looking for alternatives. A third party, a viable third party, had risen, which demonstrates that while the China factor does play a role in Taiwanese elections, it's not the only thing. And domestic priorities and daily problems also take center stage in Taiwan as well, too. Okay, so I'm going to take a quick sip of water, but the next thing I'll talk about is our election observation project. So what we do for the election observation project here in Taiwan is that we start this project in October, and we go until the vote, basically election day. And what we're trying to observe for is suspected information campaigns or operations by the PRC. And we have a workforce of about 30 people. So we have the DI team working on this, but what we also do is prior to the election observation, that summer prior to it, the start date, we started a summer school. And we trained up a group of university students to do the research, open source intelligence research that we do. We train them to look for narratives or things that we would suspect to be part of PRC information operations. And then at the end of that summer school, we will pick about, I think around 17, if I'm not mistaken, of the students to work on this election observation project. So we collected over 10,000 posts, suspicious posts, and we looked across a wide range of platforms, including Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Dcard and PTT, which is Taiwan social media. They're quite like Reddit, basically. And then we also looked into some of the Chinese social media apps like Douyin, Sohu, Bilibili, and Baidu. So what we found, the first case study in this election observation project is we also started to see some evolution of tactics and techniques. And one big thing that we have started to see was generative AI being used. So I think about 2 weeks before the election day, there was an ebook that was released called The Secret History of Taiwan, who was the outgoing president at the time. And this book purported that they had information, salacious details about Taiwan, how she was using sexual favors to gain her power of position, her childhood, her family is not a good family. I remember reading through this book and thinking to myself, and I'm pretty sure I'm about 90% correct on my suspicions. I think the book in itself was written by ChatGPT because it was meandering. It kept repeating the same points over and over again. But this book was spammed to a lot of Taiwanese influencers. They received this email or DM about the Secret History of the Taiwan book, Secret History of Taiwan ebook. And it started appearing on low-profile media websites, and there seemed to be a concerted push to promote this book. As you see here on screen, these are 2 examples of what we consider to be inauthentic coordinated behavior. There's a lot of copy and pasting of posts in Chinese by folks that are, don't exactly have the most convincing profiles as well too. Some of the things that we look for when we look at these Facebook posts is the profile pictures in themselves. We have in the past found that people have either just stolen photos off of the internet. Shopee is like a eBay website here in Taiwan, and we've seen people take photos off of there to use as profile pictures, or Photoshop and manipulate photos to make it seem like an actual profile as well too. So in this, what we also looked for was our DI team dug into the source files from the ebook in itself. And one of the indicators for us that we saw was that in China, they use simplified Chinese, which is a different writing system than what Taiwan uses, which is traditional Chinese. And what we found in the source file images was we saw some traces from China, basically, in that they did not totally get rid of all their simplified Chinese as well. So that indicates to us this originated outside of Taiwan, but also that there is signs that it may have originated in the PRC or in Southeast Asian countries that use simplified as well too. Sometimes they outsource a lot of the work to content farms that are outside of China. So that was another thing too. But what we can say for sure is that it did not originate, or what we think we can say for sure is that it did not originate in Taiwan. We found that there was a lot of conversion errors too between simplified and traditional Chinese as well. Okay. I'm just quickly going to show you. So what also happened, what we found too, was that there was a number of videos that were generated by AI that started to be posted on YouTube prior to the election voting day. These videos are purported to look like news anchors that are reporting on some story for the Secret History of Taiwan. They're all in Mandarin and Cantonese. I will say, though, that from what I've heard and what I can hear in the video, the Cantonese is not a perfect translation either. It's a word-by-word translation, which is not very smooth, or it is not at all how a native language speaker would speak Cantonese. So it's not, so little things like that does not convince the audience that this is a real video. However, I will say once technology gets better, I don't know what that looks like. And the fact that we can already start producing disinformation in different languages is a bit of a scary thought, very quickly as well too. But I'll show you a few of these videos.
英文，一个女人的名字，而非西方人使用的文字。蔡英文，中华民国总统，注定是一个风云人物。蔡氏英文，人格的自我撕裂，造就了一个政坛的伪装者。
If you're looking at this video, what we noticed right away was it might be hard to see, on the screen, but the eyes are quite dead. They don't look quite natural. They are always repeating the same hand motion as well too, and the audio and the lips don't exactly sync up. So that was a few indicators for us that this was generative AI. Another indicator.
2016年，蔡英文成为了台湾第一位女性领导人，自此这个名字也广为人知。就在蔡英文当任时，许多人都对她抱有
Again, not quite natural looking as well either.
英文，一个女人的名字。
Sorry, need to find one.
才是英文
This one's
人
in
格的
Cantonese.
自我撕裂，造就了一個政壇的偽裝者，用鎮定掩飾強橫，扮清秀掩。
But again, the Cantonese does not sound natural to most native language speakers. So it kind of indicated to us that it wasn't exactly it wasn't exactly a real person doing this either. I'm trying to remember if I can find the one with yeah, right here.
大家介绍
It might be a bit hard to see, but if you can see at the very top, there's actually a watermark that says AI. I'm not too sure if you can see it. I'm circling it with my mouse, but it says AI. So they're not exactly hiding the fact that they're using AI generated content. This was probably the first instance in Taiwan that we started seeing generative AI being used on a full scale. And what we've noticed so far, it's mostly being AI right now has just lowered the cost of an already cheap operation. It's not that hard to make disinformation. It doesn't cost that much, and AI lowers that entry to barrier even more. So we're seeing a lot more AI generated content as well too. Okay, let me see if I can move on to the
英文
next one.
流
Another thing that we started to see as well too here in Taiwan, and it's a bit of an evolution of tactics as well. I would say that this largely feels more so, if I could make a comparison, a bit more from the Russian playbook, in which they are leveraging a lot more of the domestic controversies within Taiwan to sow division and polarization. So what happened in this case was that the Taiwanese and Indian government had announced that they were going to be signing a memorandum of understanding to hire more, up to 100,000 Indian migrant workers to come to Taiwan to address the labor shortage. And this led to a major backlash in Taiwan. What happened was, rather than creating an information attack, we saw that the PRC was actually just leveraging this domestic controversy and promoting a lot of the narratives that were already circulating and trying to amplify it. One thing that we also saw was that we noticed the use of influencers a lot more. These influencers were, I think, on TikTok or Douyin, if I'm not mistaken, one of the short form videos platforms. And basically what we noticed was, before this particular political controversy emerged, these influencers were talking about lifestyles, or they were showing off their outfits of the day, or they were, showing off which restaurants you should go to. And then out of nowhere, they posted this video where they talked about how Taiwan is going to become, one of the narratives that emerged in Taiwan is that if we allowed 100,000 Indian migrant workers to come to Taiwan, Taiwan would turn into a sexual assault island. So there was a lot of leveraging of the anger that was already existing in Taiwan to sow more division. And we saw some of these influencers talk about these videos, this controversy in itself. So I'll just quickly play that here.
如果想保护身边女生的，今年选票一定要慎投。我发现很多人不知道这件事情的严重性，网络上的讨论都已经炸开了，但新闻报道却少之又少，是会因为选举的原因。
如果想保护身边女生的，今年的选票一定要慎投。我身旁居然有很多人不知道这件事的严重性，现在 D 卡上的讨论都已经炸开了。但我看新闻媒体报道真的是。
Both these videos is they followed exactly the same format. They had really similar scripts as well too. It seemed a little bit more formulaic. So we were researching those kinds of things when we looked into some of the narratives that were being promoted. in terms of the TikTok influencer and how they were being used as well too. So this also led to us noticing, to some of the other inauthentic coordinated behaviors that we were seeing. So here on Twitter, we noticed a lot of bot activity. There's a lot of users commenting on this Radio Free Asia tweet, which talked about this Indian migrant worker MOU that was being signed. And a lot of the comments under it were bots that were saying, oh, well, why are we cooperating more with India? You should cooperate more with mainland China. Makes no sense. A lot of inflammatory and racist comments about, if you let more Indian migrant workers into Taiwan, it's going to be a threat to all Taiwanese women, that kind of thing. So we started to notice that as well too. And I think it became clear that there was an attempt to also undermine India-Taiwan relations as well in this case study as well, because that's something that China wasn't too happy with. So another thing that we do as part of our election observation project here in Taiwan is that we also take whatever narratives that we have observed in the monitoring hub, and we put it all together into a survey, which we call the election survey. This election survey, what we do is that in the 2 weeks leading up to the election day, we'll conduct a telephone survey asking Taiwanese voters to rate their levels of agreement with certain narratives, especially the narratives that we had observed in this particular election, and also to answer questions about, other various socio-demographic factors. So, for example, how high is your trust in democracy? What's your level of education? Who are you going to vote for in the upcoming election? And what we did is we correlated levels of agreement with the narratives that we saw in the monitoring hub and correlated those with other demographic factors. So in this slide here, you're seeing that we correlated support with a political party with certain narratives. So some of these narratives that we observed was the Taiwanese government tolerates scam groups and scammers. And if you're more likely to disagree, you probably had pretty high support of the TPP. If you were more likely to agree, you probably had high support with the KMT. We also did that with other narratives. For example, the current ruling Democratic Progressive Party is no different from the Chinese Communist Party, and Taiwan's lack freedom of speech. So again, very high disagree if you support the TPP, but if you supported KMT, you also had a pretty high agreement rate with that as well too. So that is the survey that we do, and we've conducted that also since, I believe, 2020 as well too. We are also trying to observe people's media habits through this. We do ask people, where do you consume your political information from? And what we found in this election was that people are moving away from traditional media as well. I will say trust in traditional media here in Taiwan is very low, and it's quite polarized. A lot of the media, depending on what you consume, is quite ideologically biased. So it does frame the way that they cover issues. But in Taiwan too, we're seeing a lot of younger people move away from newspapers and news channels and starting to take a lot more of their information from YouTubers, or what we call as key opinion leaders. These are folks that are influencers that oftentimes, I don't know how they do it, but they'll do 1 or 2 hour videos on certain talking about current affairs and political topics a day or something like that. And people have their favorite KOLs. So we found that a lot of people are consuming more of their information from there as well. We also did find that if you were more likely to say that your primary source of information is from YouTube or some of the short form video platforms like TikTok, you also tended to agree more with conspiracy theories. That was a finding in our recent election survey as well too. So all in all to say, this is just one of the projects that Doublethink Lab does in a network of other civil society organizations here in Taiwan. And together they make up the model, or what we call the Taiwan Power model here in Doublethink Lab. So back in the last election, we had decided to engage with a global elections observation expert, Ben Graham-Jones, to answer a key question that I also get asked a lot, which is, what is Taiwan's model to countering disinformation? And what makes it so successful? But more importantly, what are some of the vulnerabilities, and what can other countries learn from Taiwan? So this is a recent report. It's on our website that you can take a look at as well. Basically, we do know in the background that Taiwan's resilience to the PRC information operations has been lauded internationally. It's been something that everyone has, said has been a real success story. And especially in the sense that the PRC has a lot more resources, financially, human, and that are dedicated towards information operations. And there's a huge asymmetry between the PRC and Taiwan in terms of this. But despite this international acclaim, we still face ongoing vulnerabilities and areas for improvement against the PRC's information operations as well too. So we wanted to look into that. We decided to engage with Ben Graham-Jones, who did a wonderful report for us, and he interviewed a lot of Taiwanese stakeholders across different institutions, whether that be media, civil society, government institutions, and academia, to really get a sense of what this model looks like and how it works. And, as more and more governments and civil societies like the one here today are asking, what can we learn from Taiwan? And what are the models of resilience? That's what we wanted to do with this report. It is not a prescriptive report. We're not saying that this model will work in every single context, but it's largely descriptive, and we're asking people to take a look at it and see what they can learn from it as well. So we're hoping that this offers lessons to help other countries strengthen their defenses as well too. And I did go over the methodology really quickly. So what Ben decided to do was to conceptualize the model as an acronym, which is POWER, Taiwan Power. And so this is the model in itself. And what we noticed within some of the themes of Taiwan's model to countering disinformation is that it's a very much bottoms-up approach. Comparatively to other countries, especially in the Canadian context, which I've seen, where the approach to countering disinformation is a very top-down approach. Taiwan is quite different in the sense that a lot of the work and a lot of the efforts to counter disinformation is coming from civil society and from a much more bottoms-up approach. And this is because of the first letter in our acronym, which is P for power, for purpose-driven. And it's this one will probably be the hardest to replicate, but in Taiwan, there is a shared sense of purpose to countering disinformation because the PRC, the threat is so salient. It is something that worries people about influence, the encroaching influence in Taiwan, but also of the threats of military invasion as well too. We are having actually some military drills right now being conducted around the island because the PRC is not too happy with the fact that William Lai is did a tour of the Pacific Islands and met with some US officials. So again, we are subjected to military drills whenever the PRC is unhappy, and that makes the threat much more salient. So there is a shared sense of purpose in Taiwan, and there is an understanding that this is an issue that we need to address. And that goes across different CSOs as well too. For the second letter, which is O, organic, again, as I said, that the resilience is primarily driven from the bottom up. While government here in Taiwan does play a role, they have helped in providing, overarching directions and has played a role also as a bit of a funding body. They also are managing to characterize the threat and drive home the significance and the nature of the threat of information operations. However, they largely take a step back and action is very decentralized. I will say that civil society here in Taiwan is able to adapt much more quickly and evolve more quickly, as there is less, obviously there's not so much bureaucracy to go through some of the research and whatnot, or to apply new techniques and tactics in terms of researching disinformation or information operations. And I think as well too, with the action being decentralized, you have many different organizations taking different initiatives in terms of information operations research. This is very difficult. The field is so large, so it is very difficult for one organization to take all of it on. For W, it is whole of society. This is something that I find quite unique in Taiwan, that you're seeing the resilience being expressed across different institutions. It's not just civil society organizations. We're seeing universities also take on teaching disinformation and information operations, some engagement with some of these civil society organizations, media outlets as well too. We're going to be hosting pretty shortly here a hackathon to bring together journalists and civil society members to discuss how to research and monitor information operations as well too. That's coming up in the next few months. So there is expressing this resilience across different institution and actors rather than just in one siloed body. It's always evolving, which is E. Our approach is not static. I think one of the good examples of this is that one of the organizations, I believe it's MyGoPen, which was one of our stakeholders that we interviewed, they recognized that in the upcoming 2024 elections, that generative AI was going to be an issue. So they began to test different software and techniques and tactics for monitoring disinformation prior to the 2024 election so that they could be better prepared. This is, as we mentioned in the organic part, it's because our action is very decentralized, so we are able to evolve very quickly as well too. And then finally for R, it's remit bound. This is what I find the most interesting of the Taiwan Power Model Report, which is that we have all our organizations here have different specializations, and we tend to focus on those specializations. But we do have an informal network of the civil society organizations that also work together. So a good example of this is we have a lot of collaborations and informal partnerships with the fact check centers, whereas the fact check centers, they will be monitoring any narratives that come through and be debunking them. But if they notice anything suspicious about those narratives or something that they think that we would be interested in researching further, we frequently receive many of their narratives. They'll send it our way to research and to dive in more. During the monitoring hub, we also had this as well too, where we asked other organizations to keep an eye out for narratives they thought was suspicious. And this also helps in the fact that we don't have to focus on fact checking. We have a number of different organizations. I think in Taiwan, the ones that I can count off the top of my head, I know of 3 major fact checking organizations. Taiwan Fact Check Center does live fact checking during presidential debates as well too. That's been quite impactful, I believe. And then there's also MyGoPen. There's a really interesting initiative called Kofax, where in Taiwan, the messaging app that is the most popular is Line. So they built a bot where you can send in things that you see that are suspicious. You're not sure if it's real information or if it's fake news, for example. You can send it to this Kofax and they'll check it for you. So there's a lot of initiatives like that within Taiwan as well too. And that reduces the duplication of labor, which has been very helpful and allows folks to focus on their specialization. So it creates a bit of a network and a model, kind of different parts of a moving body, essentially, in the terms of research for disinformation. So what we hope with this model basically is that Taiwan is ground zero for a lot of the PRC's influence and information techniques and tactics. And we do see that being played out in different countries as well too, which are largely the same. So what we hope with this model as well too is to provide sort of lessons from ground zero for other countries. What can you do? How does Taiwan work? And how can that be applied to different countries as well too? One thing I've been trying to champion in Canada too is that I think civil society has a role to play and an important one at it. I think there needs to be a bit more support there too, which is, difficult, and I understand there are challenges with that. But the top-down approach is important as well, but we need a better balance of the two. And in Taiwan in itself, there are quite a bit of vulnerabilities that we also need to learn from as well. So some of the vulnerabilities that were explored within our report was that one, whole of society actually might not be inclusive enough. And one thing that we had come across is that a lot of the organizations, civil society organizations, academia, universities, and media were focusing on online activities of information operations and influence operations. But really what might be more impactful is some of the offline activities. One key influence tactic that's being used by the PRC is a lot of these subsidized business trips they will take Taiwanese people on. This is to, incentivize Taiwanese people to set up more businesses in the PRC and thus become a way to influence and leverage these connections in order to undermine solidarity with Taiwan as well too. So that's one. And then another one is the the financing of religious institutions in Taiwan. A lot of the temples that are key political players as well, they are not subjected to some of the transparency mechanisms of financing. Tricky subject, but it's one of the key areas that people have found to be a vulnerability. We haven't really included those institutions within our whole of society approach. And there is also very little political appetite to regulate these institutions. So it's tough to say with those ones. There's expansion challenges, which is that engaging with more societal actors also kind of risks diluting that shared purpose that has driven the Taiwan success. So it will be crucial in the upcoming future to maintain a sense of unity, a unity of purpose, I mean. We also lack an overarching strategic vision. I will say that within the model, I can see that we respond very quickly to certain threats, and a lot of our projects are done in a short-term timeframe, short-term vision, but we don't have this overarching sense of where we're going to be in 5 years and how we're going to continue to evolve our model as well. And we definitely need greater integration with more international institutions, especially as, more of this PRC influence and information operations are also occurring outside of Taiwan. But we lack a global network to counter these narratives in other countries, which would require more data-driven messaging, and rebuttals to support pro-Taiwan narratives, but also that building a global counter-information operations capacity is very critical, and this is going to include international data sharing and analytical frameworks. So we could improve our resilience by building more international collaborations, and it is happening, but certainly we can always do more in this as well too. So yeah, that's the end of my presentation there. And I just wanted to, that is my email on screen. If you have any questions, you are more than free to email me. And there's a QR code there or our link to our website for where all the reports are that I discussed today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayman. And fascinating presentation. I think we'll jump right into questions. While we'll give everybody a few moments to begin writing. If you have any questions, I'll pass it over to Sean. I believe he may have a question or two to get us started.
I do, but I can't find out how to turn my video on. For some reason I turned it off and it's all stuck right now. Let's see if I can get it reactivated. Can you hear me all right?
We're seeing you if that's what you're worried about.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, no, for some reason it's not showing up for me. Well, Yes, fascinating presentation, Iman. It's like drinking from a fire hose for me. I guess one of the questions I'm really curious about is that school you were talking about. I'm really curious when you're sort of prepping up this school to train folks to get ready for the upcoming election. Can you tell me more about that? What does that look like? How does it structured? How do you recruit people? Yeah, just sort of walk me through that process.
So from what I understand, and I think in the future, like I can definitely connect you with the digital intelligence team who run the school. But from what I understand, it is about a week-long program in which we go across Taipei or Taiwan and look into the universities, and we put out a call asking people to come work. Or if they're interested, there is going to be the summer school on how to do information operation research. And through that process, we are just really training up these participants on how digital intelligence does their research, what they're looking for, what are the indicators of coordinated inauthentic behavior, and how do they sort of go into the analysis of what they see as suspicious behavior. Um, at the very end, I believe there's sort of like a certificate ceremony, and then after we have identified certain appropriate participants to join the election observation hub. And then after that, we start, a few line groups. People are on shifts doing the monitoring during the election observation. And this also builds up capacity in terms of we are looking into it's one of the ways that it's a bit of a double-edged dual function where we're looking to build up our resources in our own team, but also to build up societal resilience as well too, as more and more people have the capacity to do open source intelligence research. That's my basic understanding of the program, but I'd be happy to also put you in touch with DI team to
Yeah.
get into the details of that.
I'm kind of trying to get my head around sort of what is the characteristics of the people that join? Is it mostly students at the university?
Yeah. Oh,
You
it's
find a broad
university.
cross section, so it's mostly university students that you
Yeah.
find that where you
Yeah,
get your biggest
it's
uptake.
university students. Yes. Yeah.
Cool.
I think they also, we do a lot of, I've done a lot of outreach to universities as well too, which is something that's unique in which that we'll do presentations on our work. We have a number of employees that discover Doublethink Lab's work through university seminars or presentations. So we do engage with the academic community in that way. I know that there is a subset of professors here that do focus on information and influence operations. So there is that sort of exchange between civil society and academia as well. That happens quite often.
Yeah, it does seem like there's a strong connection with the universities. Like it was the Sunflower Movement and the Hong Kong protests that seemed to stimulate quite a bit of pushback against some of the interference elements. Do you see
Yeah.
any other aspects of civil society that really plays a critical role in stepping up in any of these areas?
In terms of interference or
just in terms of some of the activities that your group that you're talking about, like the power model, where you've got groups across society. Can you sort of characterize what those
I mean,
like?
there's a lot, I think there's some innovative ways that civil society that try to counter some of these activities, but not in necessarily direct ways. So for example, how to counter, when we say information operations, it's not necessarily something that's always just towards the PRC. So for example, vaccine misinformation was happening as well in Taiwan. So in order to sort of stem that, civil society played a role in that, in which they formed these focused groups towards elderly folks in Taiwan to talk about vaccine misinformation and the information they're consuming. To help sort of, we at one point had pretty low rates of vaccination among the elderly population during COVID. So that's one way. They have these focused target groups. Media literacy is huge here in Taiwan too, from what I understand. There's quite a few groups dedicated to that. As well as in Taiwan, there are two groups that are dedicated to civil defense, which is interesting. And one of them is called Kuma Academy. And alongside the curriculum of learning how to do civil defense tactics. So how do you tie a tourniquet? How do you do CPR? How do you carry a person if they're injured? These very pragmatic tactics. They also have a section on influence operations and information operations. How do you counter that with like, how do you verify the information you're looking at? How does it operate? That's built into the civil defense curriculum. So there are different ways in which, when we say it's expressed across differently in Taiwan, that's also what we mean. There's different organizations taking on the teaching of information operations.
Very cool. Christian, I take it there's some questions coming up.
There are two. The first one asks, what are some of the challenges that you face in your line of work and how do you address them? And I'm not quite clear from the question what type of challenges in particular. Those could be institutional, personal. I'll leave it to you to answer how you, in terms of what might spring to mind.
Yeah. So in terms of, I think a few challenges that people ask me about would be, the security risks to doing this kind of work. Thankfully in Taiwan, we are pretty safe to do this work. However, we definitely, put in some security measures in place, like cybersecurity measures. Certainly when we go traveling abroad, we have to be a bit more careful. So we definitely take some measures such as, I think safety measures that are pretty basic for everyone, like letting people know where you're at and making sure you're always in contact with people when they're abroad. But other challenges that I think are interesting in this work is one thing that we're grappling with, and I'm sure this is something that is probably a universal problem, is that how do we talk to the other side of folks? People in Taiwan are very polarized along political divisions as well too, just similarly to the rest of the world. And if we are just circulating our messages among a community that agrees with us, are we being impactful? Are we being effective in our intervention? And the answer is no. It's not. We're just preaching to the choir. So the thing that we're grappling with today, and one of the challenges that we're looking into today, is how are we able to do more research into the other side, people who may disagree with us politically, and also who may be, let's say, in favor of reunification. Why are they in favor of reunification, and what are ways we can? How do we talk to these communities as well too? So we're thinking in terms of strategic communications. We're thinking in terms of how do we do media literacy and interventions? How do we kind of turn down the temperature of political debates these days? Because just as probably the rest of the world, if you bring up a topic that is very politically sensitive, people will also, there is a lot of fights that happen in Taiwan as well too along those lines. If you ever want a good example of this, take a look at our legislative yuan. You'll see actual just all-out brawls happening. People actually will start fistfights. We had a pretty bad one back in May where there was just tackling of legislators and things like that over controversies and whatnot. I remember a couple of years ago, someone brought pig intestines to the legislative yuan. Good example, when they're trying to debate something, that's where the temperature is at. So the question is, how do we bring that down? What are the effective interventions? How do we talk to the other side, and how do we inoculate against disinformation as well too? I don't think having a difference of opinion or political ideology is bad, but it gets wrapped up in a lot of the misinformation and disinformation, and that's a big issue too. We need to make sure the information that people are debating or discussing is correct. So those are the challenges we're facing in that work. And we're grappling with those. I'm not too sure if that answered the question, but that's kind of what we've been discussing lately.
No, I think that's a great answer. Thank you. Next question is, does Taiwan, and by Taiwan, I take that to mean Doublethink Lab and perhaps other organizations, whether official or otherwise, that are involved in the same space, attempt to counter message into mainland China about its status, or would that be too provocative?
Too risky and too provocative, unfortunately. Yeah, it's something that we have to, measure security risks to us as well too. This is something that is actually another key challenge within our work. We a lot of our work, if it is to do with China, we have to tend to do on the looking into overseas communities rather than looking into China itself. Messaging into China is very difficult, and it poses a lot of security risks, not only to us, but if we do engage with anyone in China, it poses a huge risk to them as well too. So we have not done any of that kind of work.
Okay. Another question, how can an individual or organization support Doublethink Lab? What areas are you grappling with the most, and what sort of help is needed?
I think the areas that we're grappling with most right now is actually one area that we really need maybe some more support is generative AI. As this is a new technology, we also don't have necessarily the capacity to understand AI as quickly as it's like the advent of it. It's very, very fast. It's being used widely again now, and it's something that we have very little experience with. In terms of support in institutions, I mean, if we always welcome any support, so you can feel free to email me, and I can certainly see what we can do. But I think in terms of our areas, we also want to do more work into, I would say, some of the other areas that are not necessarily traditionally thought as being part of influence operations. A lot of our work is still observing traditional media or older social media platforms. So, for example, like Facebook. Or Twitter, when Twitter allowed us to look into the API. Obviously, that has changed under Elon Musk. But we want to start looking into different areas such as YouTube and TikTok. How do we counter disinformation on those platforms as well too, given that more and more Taiwanese people are taking their political information from there. So we have an upcoming project on TikTok as well. We're going to be surveying Taiwanese youths and how they are using TikTok and what they use TikTok for, or TikTok or Douyin, which is the Chinese equivalent of TikTok. So yeah, those are some of the areas we're looking into, and I think some of the areas that we need some work on. Another area would be strategic communications. How do we talk about Taiwan internationally? How does Taiwan broadcast their messages as well too? That's something that Taiwan hasn't really thought of before. So we're also grappling with that issue.
About the China index, I was really curious about the evolution of that tool. Do you have any good examples where it's been applied and been useful for a country to use and apply?
So I heard from one of our partners way back when that because of the way that the China index has been modeled, they thought it would be a good idea to actually do a Indonesian China provincial index. So they're starting to map out influence in Indonesia according to provinces, which I thought was a really interesting way to take the China index model and transform it to a more localized context as well too. And I think just like for us, the success stories have been mostly just being able to have an index that's comparable has been really helpful in terms of engaging with policymakers and engaging with academics as well too, to say we have an open source resource for you. You can take this data and use it how you will. So we've engaged with, I believe, like a few other CSOs has used China Index as examples and as a resource to further bolster their arguments or their research angles. I think Article 9, is it Article 19? Article 19 frequently cites the China Index. And yeah, so those are the few success stories I can think of. I think there's more interest in it now, especially in some of the more, some countries that haven't really looked into the influence either, some of the global South countries as well too. We're trying to see if we can get more partners in those areas. And yeah, our South Africa CITW summit was great in terms of connecting us to more partners there. So we're hoping to expand it.
Yeah, I thought the strength of the influence in media and academia really jumped out at me. How significant it was. Do you have any sense? And I guess you went to school here in Canada as well. Do you have a sense of how that's expressed?
Yeah, this is something that also just a little plug for my old position at Alliance Canada Hong Kong. We have a report called in plain sight, where we did a lot of open source research on Chinese influence operations. And one of the domains that we looked at was the academic sector as well too. And a lot of it is that it's largely done through these research partnerships with key industries. So at the time of that report, it was Huawei, which we're all aware of that organization, but they were giving a lot of money, a lot of research partnerships. But then the question was, exactly what technology are they looking to invest into? So there's something called the civil military technologies, where it's like there's dual use for the technologies that could also be used in the military, that kind of thing. And I think at the time, the reason the influence is so high is because academia, again, with the whole of society model that we see in Taiwan, we haven't really also brought in academia into the conversation in Canada about national security. That was a complaint I did hear among academics in Canada, that when these national security regulations came in, they're like, I don't know anything about this. How do I implement these regulations? And there was a lot of questions along those lines. But a lot of the influence is wielded through these research partnerships, and also targets certain researchers. I had a few friends who have been targeted or been offered by Huawei certain partnerships of like, I'll give you this much money, which is quite a bit of money, but you need to sign this agreement. This agreement is a little bit more vague. You're not too sure exactly what you're transferring over sometimes, that kind of thing. So that's where the influence is being wielded. It's largely through sort of a little bit of a black box of tactics. So, yeah.
Very cool.
Fascinating. Yeah. We have another question. You mentioned that you're a relatively new organization. Where do you see Doublethink Lab in the next 5 years? What are some of your big goals? A little bit of that covered off somewhat, but I'll let you answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the bigger goals for Doublethink Lab is we really want to expand more internationally. We're actually now expanding more into the Indo-Pacific. We have a partner, employee who works on PRC information operations in the Philippines. We're also starting to see a bit more of a need for more partnerships in the Indo-Pacific, especially as the PRC has been challenging certain territories outside of Taiwan and the South China Sea. So in the Philippines, they've had some conflicts in the South China Seas and Malaysia as well too. That another key partner we're hoping to do more work with is Ukraine, given the similarities between the two countries in what they face, given disinformation, information operations targeted by Russia to Ukraine versus information operations targeted by PRC to Taiwan. We also want to see how do in size, relatively smaller states to their adversaries, how do they respond to disinformation and what makes them so successful? So building capacities that way. We've done some work with some Ukrainian organizations in trying to do comparative analysis, and also how does each country really build up their capacity, trying to learn from each other as well too. And other things that we're hoping to look into is just, I think also how can Taiwan's model be applied in different contexts, and how do we expand that model to a more international stage, as to capture more of the PRC's influence tactics across the world. Trying to look into, let's say, like electoral interference. How does that play out in different countries? How is it similar and how is it different? That's another question we're looking into.
I'm kind of curious about the Kofax that you were talking about. So if I understand this correctly, there's a Line app, and they built some sort of a plugin for it, or some sort of bot, where you could ask it questions and it would then cycle those questions out to a fact checker, or how does that work?
Yeah, so Kofax basically is it's a bit of a bot, but there's fact checkers, volunteer fact checkers behind it, from what I understand. So when you put in a response or a query asking, is this something that's real information, or is this fake news? Like, this looks like disinformation. they will have a group of volunteers who are doing the crowdsourcing and doing the fact checking, and then they'll respond to you in real time, whether or not that is real or not, or if they've like reverse image search and found the original video or something to debunk some of those narratives. And then what they do too, which is really good, is they'll create a database that's open source. You can go on their website and you can look at the database of the queries that they have received of different things they have debunked as well too. That's one thing in Taiwan in the Taiwan model that I did forget to mention. Almost a lot of the work that is done in civil society is open source, and that sharing happens across different institutions as well too. That helps build up the resilience. So, but yeah, and it's just a community of mutual support from COFAX is what I understand, but they have about 250 new messages entering their database a week. So it's one of those things that it's being widely used, which is really good, but also it is also building up the capacity through a group of volunteers too.
Very cool.
Another question just came in. How is Doublethink Labs funded?
Oh, our top question. We're largely funded through various foreign civil society organizations or different institutions. So a lot of it has come through Open Society Foundation or National Endowment for Democracy initially. And then we take on different fundings like project-based fundings from different organizations. So we've done some with Radio Free Asia, the EU, External Action Service, EAS, EU EAS has also funded a few of our projects. We've worked with Internews, which is another project, especially on like transnational repression or media literacy or things like that. So it's a mix of long-term funding and a lot of project-based funding as well too. We do receive some funding from the Taiwanese government, but paperwork is a lot, so we tend to be a little bit deterred from taking on funding as well.
Okay, and the questions were coming in at a pretty even clip until that last one. So I don't, what are we? We're at 9:30 my time now. So we've gone on for some time, but I guess we can wait for another moment or two to see if any other questions come through.
Yeah. And if folks, have questions after the webinar, like I said, feel free to email me. That's no problem with me. And we can also discuss further. If you're interested in any of the projects as well, we can discuss that as well too.
Sounds good. One thing I will note while we give people on the call a moment is when you were mentioning international partnerships, one area that we're looking to learn a bit more about is I understand there is some sort of an entity in Lithuania, a country that, because of size and so forth and history, not unlike Taiwan in many respects, and how disinformation is being countered there. This is also, there's also the Taiwan connection with Lithuania because the government there has gone head to head with the PRC for Taiwan and among other things. So I don't know if you have had any information exchanges with civil society organizations there.
Not too many. From my own experience anyways, I'm not too sure if my colleagues have also talked to Lithuania folks, but I will say that, also I think there is a lot more interest from Europe about Taiwan in itself. So some of my own personal experiences is I was invited as a speaker to the NATO Stratcom Center of Excellence in Riga. I did one of their conferences. So it was a big thing because it was like, that was the first time I think that Taiwan had been on the stage there and I was able to talk about Taiwan's model and whatnot. The other thing too is that we have some interesting exchanges happening. I just recently attended a civil society exchange with the Polish office in which they brought in Polish civil society members and Taiwanese civil society organizations to talk about the work they do and exchange ideas and best practices. And I believe
a while back when Lithuania's office did come to Taiwan, there was some exchanges, but I'm not too sure in what capacity. But I think it was with the office, not with the civil society organizations. And that's something that I would say is another thing that we want to look into a bit more as well. More civil society exchanges with different countries, especially with like countries that are facing similar situations. Thinking about the Baltic states and how they have faced their situations vis-a-vis Russia and things like that. Yeah.
Okay. We don't see any more questions.
Okay.
Sean.
No, I think this has been an excellent introduction. I've certainly learned a lot. I really appreciate all the insights you've provided, Eamon. I expect I'll be reaching out with lots more questions in the future. And yeah, you've given us a lot to digest. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah.
And for everyone else online, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, sorry. Just thank you so much for the opportunity to present. So.
Yeah, and for everyone else online, thanks for tuning in, and we hope this has been informative, and we'll see if we can turn this into a series with other civil society organizations in Taiwan. So thank you very much, everyone, and good night.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Take care. Bye.